He promised he would come back for me. In a town with no forgiveness, a sheriff haunted by the ghost of his brother will offer sanctuary to an outlaw girl marked by shame, only to discover she carries the last piece of the family he lost. The town of redemption was a crucible, forged from dust and judgment, a place where sins were etched into the clapboard of the buildings and remembered longer than name. Sheriff Jonah Holt wore the town silence like a second skin, a heavy coat he'd tailored himself from grief and duty. His brother, Wyatt, had been the noise, the wild wind that kicked up the dust Jonah was always trying to settle. Now Wyatt was gone, a memory as sharp and painful as a shard of glass in the sole of his boot, and Jonah was left with the echoing quiet. He was checking the tether on his horse, the leather worn smooth beneath his calloused thumb, when the noise began. It wasn't the usual clamor of the mercantile or the clang of the blacksmith's hammer. This was a different sound, ugly and sharp, the sound of a pack of dogs that had cornered something. He saw it then, a knot of people tightening in the center of the street, their faces contorted with a kind of righteous fury. At the center of the knot was a woman, or rather, a girl, with wild, tangled hair the color of sun-scorched wheat. She was on her knees in the dirt, her dress torn at the shoulder, her form made swollen and round by the unmistakable burden of a child. The architect of the scene, Ezekiel Kane, a man whose piety was as thin as his lips, stood over her, his finger pointed like a weapon. "Harlot," he spat, the word carrying across the square. "She carries the seed of the devil, the spawn of an outlaw." Jonah felt something cold and hard settle in his gut. He didn't know the girl, but he knew the venom of this town, and he knew the shape of his duty. He began to walk toward them, his steps deliberate, each footfall a leaden weight on the dry, unforgiving earth. The crowd parted for him, not out of respect, but out of a grudging acknowledgement of the star pinned to his chest. They were a sea of hardened faces and accusing eyes, and he moved through them like a ship's prow through ice, slow and inexorable. The girl, Lila, though he did not yet know her name, didn't look up. Her world had shrunk to the patch of dirt beneath her trembling hands. Her body curled protectively around the life within her. Jonah stopped directly in front of Kane, his shadow falling over the girl like a sudden eclipse. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The silence that followed his arrival was more potent than any shout. "That's enough, Jedediah," he said, his voice low and raspy, like stones grinding together. Kane's face tightened, his self-righteousness bristling at the challenge. "Sheriff, this is a matter of moral purity. This woman consorted with the outlaw Wyatt Holt. She brings his stain into our town." The name hit Jonah like a physical blow, a ghost's fist to his heart. Wyatt, of course. The chaos, the shame, the broken lives. It always led back to his brother. For a moment the grief was so sharp it threatened to steal his breath. He looked down at the girl, really looked at her, and saw not a harlot, but a terrified child, drowning in the consequences of a love he could only imagine. He pushed the grief down, burying it deep where it couldn't interfere with the law. "Wyatt's dealings are done," Jonah stated, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "This woman has broken no law in this town. You will leave her be." He bent down, his knees cracking, and extended a hand to her. It was a gesture that cost him, an offering of alliance in the face of the town's collective scorn. She flinched, but then, after a long suspended moment, her small, dirt-caked hand rose to meet his. Her hand was bird-bound and trembling in his, a fragile thing against the hardened leather of his own. He pulled her to her feet with a gentleness that surprised even himself. She swayed, a willow in a harsh wind, and he steadied her with a hand on her elbow. She would not meet his eyes. Her gaze was fixed on the ground, as if the entire weight of the world's shame was a physical force pressing her head down. The crowd murmured, a low, unhappy rumble. They were not satisfied. They had been denied their sacrifice. Jonah ignored them. He kept his grip on her arm, a silent anchor in the turbulent sea of their judgment, and began to lead her away. Every step was an ordeal. He could feel the burn of their stares on his back, 100 tiny needles of condemnation. He could hear their whispers, words like sinner, traitor, and Holt mingling with the dust in the air. He was shielding one of their own, one of the fallen, and in their eyes, he was taking her sin upon himself. His office was at the far end of the street, a small, sturdy building of stone and timber that doubled as his home. It felt a mile away. He kept his pace steady, his face a mask of impassive duty, but inside, a storm was raging. He was protecting his brother's mess. Again. Wyatt, who had lived his life like a wildfire, careless of what he consumed, had left this one last ember smoldering in the heart of the town, and Jonah, the fire warden, was duty-bound to contain it. He felt a bitter resentment rise in him, so potent it tasted like bile. But then he felt the tremor in the arm he held, the fragile, terrified life he was leading through the gauntlet, and the resentment was washed away by something else, something heavier and more profound. Responsibility. He was the law, yes, but in that moment he felt like something more ancient, a guardian of the broken. He pushed the door to his office open and guided her inside, shutting it firmly behind them. The solid thud of the oak door closing was a definitive sound, a barrier erected against the world. The noise of the town was instantly muffled, replaced by the deep, resonant silence of his home. The air inside was cool and smelled of wood smoke, old paper, and gun oil. It was a Spartan place, clean and orderly, a reflection of the man who inhabited it. There was a desk, a cot in the corner, a stone fireplace, and 2 cells that were rarely used. A doorway led to a small back room, his private quarters. He released her arm, and she immediately drifted to the far wall, pressing herself against the cool stone, as if trying to merge with it. She was a cornered animal, all wide, haunted eyes and shallow breaths. Jonah didn't press her. He moved about the space with a familiar economy of motion, stoking the embers in the fireplace and adding a log. The crackle and pop of the wood was a comforting sound, a small pocket of life in the suffocating quiet. He gestured toward a simple wooden chair near the hearth. "Sit," he commanded, his voice softer than it had been outside. She didn't move. He sighed, a weary sound, and went to the small kitchenette. He filled a dipper with water from the bucket and brought it to her. He held it out, an offering. For a long moment she just stared at it, her throat working. Then, slowly, as if breaking a spell, she reached out and took it, her fingers brushing his. The contact was brief, electric, a flicker of human connection in a void of fear. She drank greedily, the water spilling down her chin, and the simple, desperate act seemed to break some of the tension in her small frame. He watched her, his face unreadable, his mind a turmoil of questions he knew he couldn't ask. Who was she? How had she fallen in with Wyatt? And the biggest question of all, the one that loomed over them like a thunderhead, what was he going to do with her? He motioned again to the chair, and this time she obeyed, sinking into it as if her legs could no longer support her. She cradled the empty dipper in her lap like a precious artifact. Jonah turned away, giving her the illusion of privacy. He busied himself at the stove, pulling out a pot and beginning the familiar ritual of making stew. He chopped onions and carrots with a steady, rhythmic hand, the mundane task a balm to his frayed nerves. The silence in the room was thick and heavy, punctuated only by the chop of his knife and the crackle of the fire. He didn't know what to say to her. Words were not his currency. He had always communicated through action, through presence, through the quiet authority of his badge. With Wyatt, it had been different. They had a language of shared glances and half-finished sentences, a brotherly shorthand forged in childhood. But this girl, this stranger, was a locked room, and he had no key. He could feel her watching him, her gaze a tangible weight on his shoulders. He risked a glance over his shoulder and found her eyes on him, wide and assessing. There was still fear there, but something else was creeping in. A flicker of curiosity. She was watching him, trying to understand what kind of man he was. He was the brother of the man who had presumably abandoned her, yet he was the one who had saved her. The contradiction must have been a puzzle she was trying to solve. He finished with the vegetables and added them to the pot, the sizzle and steam filling the room with a savory aroma. It was the smell of a home, of sustenance, of a life far removed from the dirt and scorn of the street. He was offering her sanctuary, a temporary reprieve, but he knew it was a fragile peace. The town of redemption had a long memory, and it did not forgive easily. He ladled the stew into a bowl and placed it on the small table next to her chair, along with a piece of bread. He didn't speak, just set the food down and retreated to his desk, creating a chasm of space between them. He sat down and pretended to be engrossed in his paperwork, the familiar scritch of his pen a counterpoint to the soft clinking of her spoon against the ceramic bowl. It was the first sound she had made that wasn't one of fear. It was the sound of acceptance, of a truce. He didn't look up, but he was acutely aware of her every movement. He listened to her eat, the slow, hesitant pace telling him she was still wary, but also famished. When the sounds stopped, he waited. A few minutes later, he heard the soft scrape of the chair and her quiet footsteps moving toward the back of the office. He had shown her the spare room earlier, a small, cell-like chamber, with a simple cot and a clean blanket. It wasn't much, but it was safe. He heard the door to the room close with a soft click. He finally allowed himself to look up. The empty bowl sat on the table, wiped clean. It was a small thing, a simple courtesy, but in the silent world they now shared, it felt like a paragraph, a thank you, an acknowledgement. He stood and walked to the table, picking up the bowl. He ran his thumb over the rim, the warmth of it still lingering. He was in over his head. He was a sheriff, not a nursemaid, not a guardian. His life was built on solitude, on the predictable rhythms of patrols and paperwork. This girl, with her silent trauma and the ghost of his brother clinging to her like a shroud, was a disruption he was ill-equipped to handle. Yet, as he looked at the closed door to her room, he knew he couldn't turn her out. To do so would be to throw her back to the wolves. And whatever his brother had been, whatever this girl had done, that was a line he would not cross. The next few days settled into a strange, unspoken routine. In the morning he would rise before dawn and make coffee, leaving a cup and a piece of bread on the table for her. He would go about his duties, patrolling the town, mediating disputes, enduring the cold glares of Ezekiel Cain and his followers. When he returned, the cup and plate would be gone, washed and stacked neatly by the sink. He never saw her. She was a ghost in his house, a whisper of presence. He would find small signs of her existence, a chair moved slightly closer to the fire, a book on his shelf infinitesimally out of place, the blanket on her cot folded with a precision that spoke of a life where small orders were the only defense against chaos. One afternoon, he came back to find his own work shirt, which he had left draped over a chair with a torn sleeve, lying on his desk. The tear was gone, replaced by a line of stitches so fine and neat they were nearly invisible. He stared at the repair, a lump forming in his throat. It was a gesture of immense significance, a quiet act of reciprocity that spoke volumes more than words ever could. He had given her shelter. She was mending his world in the only way she knew how. He felt a powerful urge to knock on her door, to thank her, but he resisted. Their communication existed in this silent space, in these actions and offerings. To speak might be to break the fragile trust they were building. He left a small basket on the table containing a bar of soap, a new comb, and a length of simple blue ribbon. He didn't know if it was the right thing to do, if it was a kindness or an intrusion, but when he returned later, the basket was gone. That evening, for the first time, the door to her room was left slightly ajar. He was sitting at his desk, cleaning Wyatt's old harmonica, the silver tarnished with disuse. He was polishing it with a soft cloth, the metal cool against his skin, his mind drifting back to long-ago days when the reedy, mournful sound of it would drift through their childhood home. It was Wyatt's instrument, as wild and free-spirited as he had been. Jonah couldn't play a note, but he couldn't bring himself to get rid of it. It was one of the few tangible things he had left of his brother. He was lost in the memory when a flicker of movement caught his eye. He looked up and saw her standing in the doorway of her room, a silhouette against the dim light within. She had washed her hair, and it hung in damp waves over her shoulders. She was wearing the simple dress he'd left for her, and the blue ribbon was tied neatly at the base of her neck. She looked less like a wild thing and more like the young woman she was. Her eyes were fixed on the harmonica in his hands. A flicker of something, recognition, pain, a memory surfacing, crossed her face. It was the most emotion he had seen from her yet. She took a hesitant step into the main room, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She stopped a few feet away, her hands clasped in front of her, a gesture that was both nervous and protective. The silence stretched, but it was different now. It was charged with unspoken history. Finally she spoke. Her voice was a low, rusty whisper, as if it hadn't been used in a very long time. "He played that," she said, her gaze never leaving the harmonica. The words, simple as they were, landed in the quiet room with the force of a thunderclap. There was no question who she meant. Jonah froze, his hand stilling on the silver instrument. The ghost of his brother, which had been a constant, silent companion, suddenly felt overwhelmingly present, standing in the space between them. Jonah looked down at the harmonica, then back at her. Her face was pale in the firelight, her eyes wide and luminous with unshed tears. The careful, silent world he had constructed around himself had just been breached. He cleared his throat, the sound loud in the stillness. "You knew Wyatt," he said. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. She gave a small, jerky nod, her gaze dropping to the floor. "Yes," she whispered, the word barely audible. She took another step closer, drawn by the object in his hands. He said it was his lucky charm, said it could sing the sadness out of a person. Jonah remembered Wyatt saying the same thing, usually with a reckless grin on his face after getting into some scrape or another. The memory was so vivid it was painful. He had built a wall around his grief, a fortress of stoicism and duty, and this girl, this stranger, was dismantling it stone by stone with her quiet words. He didn't know if he was grateful or terrified. He closed his hand around the harmonica, the metal pressing into his palm. "He had a lot of sadness to sing about," Jonah said, the words coming out rougher than he intended. It was the closest he had ever come to admitting the depth of his own pain over his brother's life and death. He saw her flinch at his tone, and he instantly regretted it. This wasn't her fault. She was just another piece of wreckage in Wyatt's wake. He softened his voice. "He was my brother." Her head snapped up, her eyes locking with his. The fear was gone, replaced by a dawning, horrified understanding. "His brother?" she breathed. "You're the sheriff. He never told me his brother was the law in redemption." A bitter, ironic smile touched Jonah's lips. Wyatt wasn't one for sharing inconvenient truths. The revelation hung between them, a new, complex layer to their shared confinement. He was not just her rescuer, he was family to the man who had brought her to this state. The confession unspooled from her in the days that followed, not in a torrent, but in quiet, fragmented pieces, offered up in the lamp-lit evenings. Her name was Lila Vance. She had met Wyatt a year ago when he'd passed through the small, nameless settlement where she lived. He had been charming and full of wild promises of a life beyond the dust and drudgery she had always known. He had played his harmonica for her, under the stars, and she, a girl starved for beauty, had fallen for the song. He had left, promising to return and build them a home, a place where they could be safe. She had waited, but he never came back. Instead, word eventually reached her of his death, a shootout with a posse in the next territory. Left with nothing and her condition becoming obvious, she had been cast out by her own people. With a desperate, foolish hope, she had made her way to redemption, the only place he had ever mentioned by name, clinging to the idea that he might have left something for her, some message, some provision. Instead, she had found only Ezekiel Kane and his mob. As she spoke, Jonah listened, his face a stony mask, but his insides churning. Each word was another brushstroke in the portrait of his brother's carelessness. He had known Wyatt was reckless, but he had never fully grasped the scope of the damage he left behind. He saw the story, not just from Lila's perspective, but from Wyatt's too. The easy promises, the flight from responsibility, a pattern as old as Wyatt himself. Jonah felt a familiar, weary anger toward his dead brother, an anger that was now complicated by a fierce, protective pity for the girl sitting across from him. She was the final, living consequence of Wyatt's choices, a responsibility that had now fallen squarely on his shoulders. The air in the small house grew thick with these shared histories, with the ghosts of the man who connected them. One evening, as a cold rain lashed against the windows, he saw her sitting by the fire, her hand resting on the swell of her stomach, a look of profound sadness on her face. In her other hand she clutched a small, tarnished silver locket. She opened and closed it with a nervous, repetitive motion. Jonah watched her for a long time before speaking. "What is that?" he asked gently. She started, her eyes flying to his, wide with alarm. She tried to hide the locket in her palm, a furtive, guilty movement. He walked over and knelt before her, his posture one of supplication, not demand. "Lila, let me see." He held out his hand, his palm open. He was not the law now. He was just a man asking for a piece of his past. With trembling fingers, she placed the locket in his hand. It was warm from her touch. He fumbled with the clasp, his thick fingers clumsy against the delicate mechanism. It sprang open. Inside were two tiny, faded portraits. On one side was a younger Lila, her face bright with a hope that was now painfully absent. On the other side was a face he knew as well as his own. It was Wyatt, grinning, that infuriating, charming grin, his eyes full of the wild light that had always drawn people to him and had ultimately led to his destruction. Jonah stared at the image, his breath catching in his chest. The truth, which he had suspected, which he had danced around for days, was now staring him in the face, captured in a tiny, tinny photograph. He looked from the locket in his hand to Lila's swollen belly, and the final, devastating piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The child she carried was not just the spawn of an outlaw, as Cain had spat. It was a Holt. It was his brother's child, his blood, his kin. A wave of emotion so powerful it was disorienting washed over Jonah. It was grief, raw and sharp, for the brother he had lost, and the nephew or niece he would never know. It was anger at Wyatt's irresponsibility, leaving this legacy of shame and fear for a young girl to carry alone. But beneath it all there was something else, something fierce and undeniable, a profound sense of connection. This child was the last living piece of his brother, the last ember of the Holt family line, a line he had thought would end with him. He was no longer just a sheriff protecting an outcast. He was an uncle protecting his own. He closed the locket with a soft snap and handed it back to her. He looked into her eyes, and for the first time she did not look away. In that shared gaze, a silent understanding passed between them. The secret was out, and its presence changed everything. "He is my family," Jonah said, his voice thick. He was speaking of the child, but he was also speaking of her. He had drawn a circle of protection around her when she was a stranger. Now that circle was forged in blood. It was an unbreakable vow. He stood up, the decision settling in him not as a choice, but as an inevitability. His solitude was over. His quiet, orderly life was shattered. In its place was a new, terrifying, and sacred duty. He was the only thing standing between this girl and her child and a world that would see them destroyed. The weight of it was immense, but for the first time since Wyatt's death, he felt a sense of purpose that went beyond the badge. It was the purpose of family. The fragile peace of their sanctuary could not last. Redemption was a small town, and secrets were a currency that traveled faster than horses. The whispers that had followed Jonah down the street grew louder, more brazen. He was no longer just seen as a compassionate, if misguided, sheriff. He was seen as a man compromised, a Holt protecting another Holt's sin. Ezekiel Cain, smelling blood in the water, seized the opportunity. He began to preach, not just on Sundays, but on street corners, his voice a venomous whip lashing out at the corruption that had taken root in the heart of their town, right in the sheriff's office. "He harbors the harlot and her bastard child," Cain would thunder, his face purple with righteous rage. "He places the tainted blood of his own family above the moral purity of this community. The law is tainted, the badge is stained." Jonah would hear the words from his office, a slow poison seeping under the door. He saw the effects every time he stepped outside. The blacksmith would suddenly be too busy to shoe his horse. The woman at the mercantile would serve him with thin, pursed lips, her eyes cold. Old friends would cross the street to avoid him. He was becoming an outcast in his own town, the isolation he had once cultivated now being forced upon him as a punishment. He bore it with his usual stoicism, his face an unreadable mask, but inside a cold anger was building. This was not about justice or morality. It was about power. Cain was using Lila, using the memory of Wyatt, to challenge his authority, to turn the town against him. He was feeding their fear and prejudice, stoking a fire that Jonah knew could quickly grow into an uncontrollable blaze. Lila felt the shift as well. She no longer left her room, the house once again becoming her prison, but this time the bars were forged from the town's hatred. She would watch Jonah from the window as he walked through the town, his shoulders squared against the weight of their scorn. She saw the price he was paying for protecting her, and the guilt gnawed at her. One evening she found him staring into the fire, his face etched with a weariness that went bone deep. "You should send me away," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "This is because of me. I am bringing this trouble to your door." Jonah turned to look at her. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with a desperate resolve. She was trying to save him, to sacrifice herself for his sake. The thought enraged him, not at her, but at the town that had pushed her to this point. He walked over to her, his expression fierce. "No," he said, his voice low and adamant. "This trouble was here long before you. This town, they need a sinner to punish, so they don't have to look at their own stained hands." He reached out and for the first time touched her face, his thumb gently brushing her cheek. It was a gesture of profound tenderness, an anchor in the storm. "You are not the trouble, Lila. You and this child, you are all that matters now. This is my fight." Her eyes filled with tears, but she did not cry. She simply nodded a silent acceptance of his vow. In that moment, they were no longer just a sheriff and his ward. They were allies, a fortress of two against the world. He knew then that he could no longer just endure the town's judgment. He had to confront it. He had to make his stand. The next day, Cain called a town meeting in the square, right in front of the church. It was a calculated move, designed to wrap his venom in the cloak of piety. The whole town was there, a grim-faced assembly ready to pass judgment. Jonah watched them gather from his office window. He saw the hardened faces, the fearful eyes, the self-righteous certainty. He checked the pistol at his hip, not out of a desire to use it, but for the weight of it, the solid reminder of his authority. Then he straightened his shoulders, took a deep breath, and walked out to face them. He moved through the crowd, which parted for him like the Red Sea, a path of silent condemnation leading to the center where Cain stood, his Bible held aloft like a weapon. "Here he is," Cain cried, pointing a trembling finger, "the sheriff who has forsaken his duty, the man who puts family sin above the law of God and man. Sheriff, you defile this town by sheltering that woman." The crowd murmured in agreement, their collective anger a palpable force. Jonah did not look at Cain. He turned to face the people, his people, the ones he had sworn to protect. He let his gaze drift over them, meeting their eyes one by one. He saw farmers he'd helped, mothers whose lost children he'd found, men he'd drank with in quieter times. He let the silence stretch, letting the weight of his presence settle over them. When he finally spoke, his voice was not loud, but it cut through the air with the clarity of a bell. "My duty," he began, his voice steady and calm, "is to the law, and the law protects the innocent. The woman in my home is Lila Vance. She has committed no crime." A man shouted from the crowd, "She carries an outlaw's shame." Jonah's eyes snapped to the man, his gaze like flint. "She carries a child," he corrected, his voice dropping, becoming more personal, more powerful. "And that child is a Holt. That child is my blood. My brother's son." A gasp went through the crowd. The rumor was now a public confession. Jonah let the revelation sink in, letting them grapple with a new reality. This wasn't about some faceless sinner anymore. This was about family, his family. He continued, his voice resonating with a conviction that came from the very core of his being. "This is not about morality. It is about a mob wanting a victim. It is about fear and judgment and a cruelty that has no place in a town that calls itself redemption." He turned his gaze back to Ezekiel Cain, who looked momentarily stunned by Jonah's directness. "The law is not a weapon for your personal crusades, Jedediah, and this badge is not a symbol of your judgment. It is a shield for the weak." He took a step forward, his hand resting on the butt of his gun, not as a threat, but as a symbol of his office. His final words were not for Cain, but for every person standing in that square. They were a line drawn in the dust, a declaration of war on their prejudice. "Lila Vance and her child are under my protection. They are my family. Anyone, and I mean anyone, who threatens them will answer directly to me, not to a mob, not to a preacher, to the law." He stood there for a long moment, the force of his will holding the crowd in stunned silence. He had taken their hatred and their judgment and thrown it back in their faces, wrapped in the authority they had granted him. He had made it personal. He had made it about his blood. Then, without another word, he turned his back on them all and walked back to his office, the silence he left behind him more powerful than all their shouts combined. He had made his stand. Now he would wait for the consequences. That night, the sky broke open. A furious storm rolled in over the plains, mirroring the tempest brewing in the town. Rain fell in solid, wind-whipped sheets, and thunder cracked like the sky splitting apart. Inside the small office, Jonah sat by the fire, a shotgun resting across his lap. He knew his declaration wouldn't be the end of it. He had challenged Cain's power, and a man like Cain would not let that stand. He had shamed the mob, and shame often curdled into a more violent rage. He was listening to the storm, both inside and out, when he heard a new sound, a low cry from the back room. It was Lila. He was on his feet in an instant, his heart pounding. He found her on the cot, her face pale and beaded with sweat, her hands clutching her swollen belly. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of pain and terror. "It's time," she gasped. "The baby. It's coming." A cold dread washed over Jonah. The one midwife in town was the wife of one of Cain's most ardent followers. There was no help to be had. They were alone. Just as this new, terrifying reality set in, he heard it. Through the howl of the wind and the drumming of the rain, another sound emerged. The splintered, angry roar of voices, accompanied by the guttering, hellish light of torches. He rushed to the window and peered out. A mob, larger and uglier than before, was marching on his office. They were drunk on whiskey and Cain's venom, their faces twisted into masks of blind fury. They carried torches, pitchforks, and clubs. They were no longer a group of concerned citizens. They were a lynch mob. The two storms, one of nature and one of man, converged on his small stone house. Outside, the mob chanted and roared, their torches casting demonic, dancing shadows against the rain-streaked windows. Inside, Lila's cries grew more frequent, more desperate, a rhythm of life struggling to be born against a backdrop of death. Jonah was a man, trapped between two fronts, a lone soldier fighting a war on two battlefields. He bolted the heavy oak door and barred the windows, his movements quick and efficient. He loaded his pistol and the shotgun, the metallic clicks loud and final in the charged air. He was a lawman preparing for a siege, but he was also a terrified man about to witness the miracle and terror of birth. He raced between the main room and the small bedroom, his mind splitting in two. He would check the door, listen to the threats being hurled from the darkness, then rush back to Lila, wiping her brow with a cool cloth, murmuring words of encouragement he didn't feel. "They're going to break down the door," she sobbed, her body racked with another contraction. "They're going to kill us." Jonah gripped her hand, his own calloused palm slick with sweat. "I will not let them touch you," he swore, his voice a low, fierce growl. "I will not let them touch this child." A heavy timber crashed against the door, the wood groaning in protest. "Holt! Send out the harlot! Send her out or we'll burn you out!" It was Cain's voice, shrill and unhinged. Jonah left Lila's side and stood before the door, the shotgun held ready. He was a wall. He was a shield. He was all they had. The pounding grew more frantic, the wood splintering. He could smell the smoke from their torches. Time was running out. He braced himself against the door, the wood shuddering with each blow. The mob was a beast, mindless and ravenous, and it wanted in. He could hear Cain screaming, whipping them into a frenzy, promising them righteousness for their violence. Jonah was a man of peace, a man who believed in the slow, steady power of the law. But in that moment, he was prepared to unleash a violence of his own to protect what was inside. He raised the shotgun, aiming it at the splintering wood, his finger tightening on the trigger. He would not fire on his own townspeople, but they would not get through this door while he drew breath. He was no longer just Sheriff Jonah Holt. He was the guardian of a legacy, the protector of a new life. Just as a final mighty crash signaled the door was about to give way, a new sound cut through the chaos. It was not the roar of the mob, the crack of thunder, or the splintering of wood. It was a cry, a sharp, piercing, and utterly vital wail, the sound of a newborn baby, drawing its first breath in a world of violence and rage. The cry was so pure, so elemental, it seemed to suck the very air from the night. It sliced through the drunken fury of the mob like a razor. Outside, the pounding stopped. The shouting died away into a confused murmur. The sound of new life, unexpected and undeniable, had pierced their rage-fueled haze. Jonah stood frozen, the shotgun still raised, listening. He could hear the baby's continued cries, a powerful, insistent declaration of its own existence. The sound was a judgment, a condemnation of their actions far more potent than any words he could have spoken. It was the sound of innocence. The silence that fell over the mob was heavy and thick with shame. In the flickering torchlight, men began to look at each other, the bloodlust draining from their faces, replaced by a dawning horror at what they had become. They had come to destroy a sinner, to purge a stain, and they had been met with the sacred sound of childbirth. The torches, once symbols of their righteous fury, now seemed to illuminate only their own ugliness. Without a word, one man lowered his pitchfork and turned away, disappearing into the rain-soaked darkness. Then another, and another. The beast was breaking apart, its courage dissolving in the face of that tiny, powerful cry. Ezekiel Cain shrieked at them, "Don't stop! We are doing God's work!" But his words were hollow, his power broken. The sound of the baby had revealed him for what he was, a man who trafficked in hatred, not piety. The mob melted away, leaving Cain alone in the mud and the rain, a pathetic figure screaming at the storm. Jonah lowered the shotgun, his body trembling with adrenaline and relief. He leaned his forehead against the splintered door, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He listened as the baby's cries softened, soothed by a mother's touch. He turned and walked on unsteady legs to the back room. The air was thick with the scent of birth, of sweat and blood and life. Lila was lying on the cot, exhausted but radiant, her hair plastered to her forehead, and nestled in the crook of her arm, wrapped in a coarse blanket, was a small, perfect child. A boy. He had a full head of dark hair and a tiny, scrunched-up face. As Jonah watched, the baby's eyes fluttered open. They were bright, curious, and unmistakably Holt eyes. They were Wyatt's eyes, looking back at him from a new and innocent face. A year bled into the next, washing the town of Redemption clean of its worst sins. The great storm that had brought forth both a child and a reckoning seemed to have scoured the bitterness from the air. Ezekiel Cain, his authority shattered, had slunk away in the dead of night, his brand of hatred no longer finding fertile ground. The town, humbled and ashamed, had found a quieter, more genuine path to its name. A fragile peace had settled over them, born from the memory of a night when they had stared into the abyss of their own making and chosen to step back. The sheriff's office was no longer just a bastion of the law. It had become a home. The barred cells held firewood now, and the stark cot where Lila had spent her first fearful nights had been replaced by a sturdy, hand-carved rocking chair. The air no longer smelled only of gun oil and old paper, but of baking bread and soap and the faint, sweet scent of a baby. Jonah Holt was a changed man. The grief for his brother had not vanished, but it had softened, its sharp edges worn smooth by the relentless, joyful demands of new life. The stoic silence that had once been his armor was now a comfortable quiet, filled with the gurgles and coos of his nephew. He was no longer just a sheriff, he was an uncle, a guardian, a partner. He was a family man. He watched from the doorway as Lila sat in the rocking chair, humming a soft, tuneless melody to the boy in her arms. The child, whom they had named Samuel, after Jonah's father, reached a tiny, chubby hand up to touch her face. Lila's own face, once a mask of trauma and fear, was now calm and open, her smile easy and frequent. She had reclaimed her voice, not with loud declarations, but with soft lullabies and gentle laughter. One bright spring morning, Jonah stood in the small yard behind the office. The yard, once barren and dusty, now boasted a small, thriving vegetable garden, a testament to Lila's patient and determined hands. He was holding Samuel's hands, the boy's small, bare feet unsteady on the cool earth as he took his first wobbly, triumphant steps. Samuel squealed with delight, his eyes so like Wyatt's, shining with pure, unadulterated joy. Jonah felt a profound sense of peace settle over him, a feeling so complete it was almost overwhelming. He had spent so long guarding the past, haunted by his brother's ghosts, that he hadn't realized he was supposed to be building a future. He looked at the child, this impossible, miraculous boy, and he saw not the sins of the father, but a promise, a new beginning, a chance for redemption that had nothing to do with the town and everything to do with the love that had taken root in this small stone house. Lila came to stand beside him, her hand resting on his arm. They didn't need to speak. Their silence was no longer one of shared grief or unspoken trauma. It was a language of its own, a deep, resonant quiet, built from shared meals, sleepless nights, and the steady, growing rhythm of their life together. It was the silence of a home, of a family forged not in blood alone, but in the crucible of shared survival, and a love that had grown, slow and stubborn as a root in hard-packed earth. He looked from his brother's son to the woman who had brought him into the world, and he knew, with a certainty that anchored his very soul, that he was finally home. The quiet lawman and the outcast girl had found their sanctuary, not in a place, but in each other.